Okay, welcome to the Swing Trading with Cycles channel. Let's do our precious metals update. It is December 7th. We'll start with gold here, gold daily chart. So we have a high on day 22. It is currently day 24. Gold cycles tend to be in the 30 to 33 day range. So you would think this is a pretty good candidate for a daily cycle high, yet we're now making a new high on the daily chart. So to be clear, this is a little daily swing low that just printed, right? So that is obviously usually bullish. The other cross current here is that we have a week of catalysts next week, so the FOMC and the CPI. So you would expect that next week is going to be a huge pivot point, and now it's a question of, is that going to be gold and precious metals rallying out of a daily cycle low, or is it possible it's actually them printing a daily cycle high? That's going to be interesting to kind of watch. There's still some time now because that's next Wednesday, so it's almost another week from now. But we'll watch these levels. At this point, we're trying to retest this high. And more importantly, on the weekly chart, what does this mean for us? Gold is a little bit squirrely because we have this kind of like triple bottom here. And to be clear, this low from September is what is potentially the 8-year cycle low, because it is the lowest low of these lows, which is to say these two lows are higher lows. But I mean, this is pretty ugly action either way. Like, this is just a kind of a chop zone. All that to say, if you read this as your ICL, then that puts us in week 5. But regardless of what week it is, the important thing is, we talked about this in our last video, we needed to make sure we don't break the 1740 area, which would be a weekly low, and we haven't. So far, we're now reversing higher. This is becoming consolidation at the upper end of the range on the weekly chart. So that is very bullish, right? That doesn't mean we're guaranteed to this, but like, by having this candle, and we still have 2 days left of trading, obviously, it sets up for something like this, right? So it sets us up for this to be a little consolidation and this to be our next up move, in the same way that these two were a little consolidation and this was our up move, that sort of thing. So that is positive. And again, we're just going to have to kind of tread water here while we wait for the Fed announcement. And on the monthly, we're still above last month's high, which itself is a beautiful big swing low that took out these lows here. So we are still very much in the territory. We're still very much in a place where September was likely the 8-year cycle low for gold. So far, we're not getting evidence that it wasn't. Now, this is the 10-period moving average, and you can see we're starting to pull back right as we get there. A close above it would be super, super important, and we obviously have to wait for the rest of the month to see that, but a move above it now is something that we want to see. Let's move on to silver, and then we'll look at GDX. I'm going to go through these relatively quickly, because again, I think we're just kind of treading water here before the big catalyst next week. So for silver, this thing held pretty much exactly where you wanted it to hold, as I posted on Twitter. And we're now getting, again, just like gold, this is a little swing low on the daily, very bullish, right above the 10-period moving average. For silver though, you know, that day 22 top for gold is actually day 36 for silver. So that's pretty late, unless this is a new cycle. But again, we have the big catalyst next week that we're watching for. But I would say right now, this move up, this little swing low, is certainly enough to trade off of. You can easily just put your stop, you know, right below that $22 area. And if we look at the monthly chart, if you look at the weekly chart, similar to gold, we needed to make sure we held above last week's low, and we have so far. Right now, this is becoming consolidation on week 14. Now, that said, it's still getting late in the weekly cycle. So it would be unrealistic for us to expect this weekly cycle to run, like, let's say 10 more weeks, because next week will be week 15. I would say 20 weeks is probably the best that we're going to get. Just historically, that's what, this was literally our most bullish weekly cycle ever for silver in the last 10 years, right? And so to expect much more than 20 weeks is unrealistic, again, in my mind. But that still means another, 4 or 5, even 6 weeks of upside from here. Just, we'll want to be cautious and make sure that we're looking for exit signals when we expect that they should come. Again, next week is going to be the big catalyst, so we're going to see how that all plays out. And the monthly chart is looking pretty good. I mean, we're building an upper wick on this monthly, on our December candle. But just overall, look at this. 4 green months so far, right? When you think about a chart, big picture, is this something I would want to be long? Not even knowing what it is, my answer would be yes. Why? Because the higher time frames are green, right? Because we're above a swing low, right? It looks like we're trying to work to kind of test these levels, even if we don't go back to all-time highs. you still have a nice trade to get back to like the $26 area, let's say, for instance. And finally, let us do GDX, the miners. So the miners look more similar to silver than gold in that respect. So for the miners, that top was on day 19, so it's day 20, 21, 22, 23. And again, they're all doing the same thing. They're trying to retest that high, and we're going to have to see how they react up there. And again, we know we have that catalyst coming right around the corner. For GDX, we still haven't made a new high above last week's high, so week 9 stands as your high, which was last week. This is just week 10, so we're a little bit earlier in the weekly cycle for GDX than we are for silver. Also notice on all my charts that yellow line is going to be your 200 period moving average. This is a weekly chart, so this is your 200 week moving average. Notice this is happening below the 200 week moving average. I suspect at this point we're going to blast through it. Notice how we hovered above it for 5 weeks before we cascaded lower. I suspect this is the same kind of idea, but in reverse, right? Where we're hovering below it before we kind of blast through. But similar to silver, you're going to want to be ready to sell. You're going to want to be ready to react to a weekly cycle high. I could see that coming in around the $33 area, right? Like we make a move up here and then we begin the weekly cycle decline. And we'll want to watch that weekly cycle decline because we would expect it to be relatively mild for a weekly cycle decline, which is to say it shouldn't give back most of the gains to suggest, because if we are in a new 8-year cycle, right? Because think about that. If we're in a new 8-year cycle, there are going to be several weekly cycle declines that we're going to experience, like many of them by definition, because we're going to be in an 8-year cycle, thereabouts. So we would expect those declines to be on the milder end to not give back all the gains that we experienced in the weekly cycle advance. So that's what we're going to want to watch for. I will note that GDX is actually red on the month, whereas gold and silver are still green. So that's important to note, especially since GDX had been sort of leading the metals themselves. So we're going to want to keep an eye on that for sure. But we're well above the swing low levels. And again, we're going to have to see how these things react to those big catalysts next week, that inflation number and the Fed. And I'll just mention really quickly, I have a separate video about that, but I'll just, like, if you look at the dollar, we're in like a creepy, crawly daily cycle advance, which is great news for precious metals, obviously, because we know we're going to need a daily cycle advance. It's just a question of how weak it's going to be. And so I'm expecting these things to pivot all next week around that catalyst, right? Like potentially a daily cycle high for Deep Dixie and then a resumption of the uptrend for the metals. But we're going to have to see. We'll continue to watch. And I'll provide updates on Twitter. If you're not following on Twitter, definitely take a look at the link in the description. If anything big happens between now and next week, I'll certainly post about that as well. But it seems like we're probably going to be a little bit quiet until we get those big catalysts out of the way. So that's our update for the precious metals today. Thanks for watching.